Wusstest du, dass Zehntausende deutsche Unternehmen bereits Shopify nutzen? Von innovativen Start-ups bis hin zu Familienunternehmen mit langer Tradition? Die Commerce-Plattform Shopify revolutioniert Millionen von Unternehmen weltweit. Mit Shopify kannst du Produkte über beliebige Kanäle verkaufen. Ob persönliches POS-System oder umfassende E-Commerce-Plattform. Auch Social Media und Marktplätze wie Facebook, Instagram und eBay werden unterstützt. Dank der ständig wachsenden Auswahl innovativer Funktionen und des zuverlässigen technischen Supports ist es ganz einfach, dein Business mit Shopify aufzubauen. Ob Produktpräsentation oder Bestell- und Zahlungsabwicklung. Shopify bietet alles, was du für die Verwaltung deines Business brauchst. So kannst du dich ganz auf dein Business konzentrieren. Shopify kostenlos ausprobieren und dein Business voranbringen. Shopify.de/try besuchen. Also shopify.de/try. Made for Germany. Powered by Shopify.
Every Nigerian must be instrumental to the growth and development of our nation through the use of innovative energy and idea to lead and initiate policies that will sustain the economy and enhance good governance. With all the financial turmoil facing the world, it has become pertinent for exchange of new ideas that will enhance good governance. Please subscribe to our channels, listen to our messages and engage with us. With your support, we can transform the lives of all Nigerians. Welcome to the Season 2 of the NESG Radio.
Welcome to NESG Radio. I am pleased to have with me Ms. Etemore Glover. She is the CEO of Impact Investors Foundation, which is the Secretariat for the Nigerian National Advisory Board for Impact Investing. So we'll be delving into impact investing in Nigeria. Expect to learn some very interesting facts about the Nigerian impact investment ecosystem. My name is Oluwaseyi Vincent. I am your host for today. Ms. Glover, welcome to the studio.
Thank you very much, Oluwaseyi.
Lovely. Okay, so the Nigerian National Advisory Board for Impact Investing, NABI, is collaborating with the Nigerian Economic Summit Group on the project Investing for Impact in Nigeria. Deep dive into agriculture, education, and health sectors. What motivated this project?
Thank you very much, Oluwaseyi, for asking that question. The Nigerian National Advisory Board for Impact Investing was inaugurated as a program under the Impact Investors Foundation. When we set up the board, we wanted to be quite specific about the priority sectors that we should be providing interventions. We didn't want to be all things to everyone. We wanted to have a focus. And it was an interesting time because we had seen the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on sectors, particularly healthcare and even education. And so working with PwC and some other support organization, we came up with a business case and presented to the National Advisory Board made up of 15 members. And then we looked at some sectors and we saw healthcare sector, education and agriculture were those sectors that hadn't received significant investments and they had the capacity of particularly agriculture in contributing to job creation. And so we chose healthcare, education, and agricultural sectors with gender and sustainability as cross-cutting considerations. And so we needed more data, we needed more information about those sectors. Particularly wanted to know the available financial instruments that were in existence in those sectors. We wanted to understand the gaps. We also wanted to see how far policy had come in terms of strengthening or influencing those sectors. And so those were the thoughts behind it. So an opportunity came with the Global Steering Group for Impact Investing, the umbrella body for the National Advisory Board for Impact Investing, working with some other countries like Ghana, Peru, and Chile. They wanted us to see how we could work with local think tanks and local researchers to design a project around the NAB priority areas. And so since our National Advisory Board in Nigeria had identified these three sectors and we didn't have enough data to design solutions around them, we thought, okay, let's do this project. And we were quite intentional about who to work with. The NESG has, capacities in several aspects in terms of, engaging with the public on policy, and economic issues in terms of also influencing policies, and carrying out research. So being a member of the National Advisory Board was a no-brainer. One, they understood where the National Advisory Board should be going. So we reached out to the NESG and we co-created the study, went through various processes with the project team, and then came out with the proposal, which was accepted by the Global Steering Group for Impact Investor, and that's how we started the project last year.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for that answer. So you've already touched on the next question I would just like to ask you. So the project focuses on agriculture, education, and health sectors, like you just mentioned. What makes these sectors critical in the discussion on impact investing in Nigeria? I know you spoke about job creation and probably inadequate amount of impact investment going also into these sectors. Would you just mind, expatiating on these factors?
I'll take it from this first angle, from the United Nations SDG, Sustainable Development Goals. Food insecurity is a huge issue globally. And here in Nigeria, we also face food insecurity. It's really alarming, for a country with 200 million people with arable land. There is no cause for us to have food insecurity. Then looking at the agricultural sector has a lot of potential, particularly from 2017, where we see agricultural sector contributing quite significantly to the gross domestic product. It was as a result of government intervention, right? So we see a 24% contribution to the GDP. Job creation, is quite high in the agricultural sector. If we invest rightly in that sector, we would not only address food insecurity, we'll also be addressing the lack of quality jobs that I think is a huge challenge. Unemployment today is about 33.3%, and it is also estimated that it will go as high as 41%, which is quite high. The youth population is about 60% of the total population in Nigeria, and if you are not gainfully employing your youth, some of the social malaise that could come from it will be youth unrest. So if you have a sector that can create or address something like unemployment, you want to focus to see how can I, fund that sector across all the value chain and address some constraint in each value chain, because each value chain has its own particular constraint that should be addressed, and adequate capital should be going towards it. And also in doing that, you're also providing sufficient food for your populace. Hence, that's very important. For the healthcare sector, the healthcare tourism in Nigeria is running to its trillions. That is huge capital flight. Funds that can be deployed in the country towards building infrastructure for the healthcare sector is going out to other countries. What can we do to strengthen from the primary healthcare to the secondary and tertiary healthcare? Involves, both the federal government and also the private sector. So, the COVID-19 pandemic was just an eye-opener to see how uninvested, the government has been in this sector. So that was for us a point where we had to pause and say which sectors are critical towards, development. And then educational sector, no country can achieve its full maximum potential without deliberately investing in the educational sector. Currently, we now have close to 18 million out-of-school children from 10 million. The additional 8 million, why is that? Of course, part of it is as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, but that will continue to rise as we see, economic hardship, going higher in the country, inflation. The average Nigerian will first think about, I need to exist, I need to live, I need to eat. With 100 million population, 133 million actually, living in multi-dimensional poverty and living on less than $2 a day. The first thing you'd ask yourself is, how am I going to feed for today? Education will not be on your mind. But if we're not deliberate about ensuring that children go back to school, then that will be a huge problem. The financing gap in the educational sector is quite wide. If we start looking at the figures, then these are the things I think can contribute towards, having a very strong economy, providing job, ensuring that you have an educated populace. The populace are well skilled in terms of, it's a vicious circle, I would say. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, so you've just highlighted how critical these three sectors are to Nigeria's growth and development, and also, the other aspects about job creation and, the future of the nation, etc., etc. So what I would now like to know is about the current state of impact investing in Nigeria. So how is the ecosystem, and do we also have enough knowledge about impact investing within the country?
Impact investing sector in Nigeria is growing. I want to not say that it is too nascent, because we're not where we used to be several years back. In 2015, a report was commissioned by the Global Impact Investing Network. I looked at the Nigerian ecosystem, in fact, the West African ecosystem. There were about 28 impact investors. Today, we're close to 100 impact investors that are deploying capital in Nigeria. The Development Finance Institute still dominates the space, deploying more volume of impact capital. However, you see more private sector investors. About 30% has been increased since 2019, when the IIF commissioned the second study to look at the impact investing market. As at 2007, year-to-date September of that year, the volume of impact capital was about $4.7 billion US. Impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic, we saw a dip in the deployment of impact capital in 2020, 2021. However, there's a bounce back. More people are aware about impact investing. There is so much noise about impact investing. You have more investors looking for opportunities to come into emerging markets like Nigeria, Sub-Saharan Africa. And why is that so? It provides two things. One, the opportunity to make an impact because of the scale of our social and environmental challenges. We mentioned earlier on 133 million people living in abject poverty in Nigeria. The potential, to address the challenges that they are facing is quite high. In terms of creating jobs, there's that potential. Then urbanization, you have lots of young people who are migrating from, rural area into cities like Lagos, Port Harcourt. There's the demand, for housing, affordable housing for young people. You see the real estate sector being robust and, creating opportunities for jobs. But the question is, how do we ensure that the right policies are in place to unlock more impact capital, particularly from private stakeholders, institutional investors, particularly pension funds, where you have huge, colossal amount of funds. We haven't been able to do that in the impact investing space, but we've seen it grow quite significantly. And this is besides the inconsistent economic, and landscape we've had in the last 10 years in Nigeria. Lots of prospects, lots of inflows, but we need to see more local participation from local impact investors, putting their money where their mouth is.
Great. So it's good to know that impact investing is growing in Nigeria, and we hope that trend continues. Okay, so now let's delve into the specific sectors which the report addresses. So we'll start off with the agriculture sector. So the agriculture sector is diverse when broken down into subsectors. Given the variation in activities and gestation periods, this diversity has implications for the kind of financing needed and the financing gap. How can impact investing help plug the financing gap in the agriculture sector? That's a loaded question.
That's $1 million question, because when you look at the agricultural sector, it's an informal sector, largely informal, with about 38 million smallholder farmers, constituting about 80% of the population of the farming community in Nigeria. It is alarming. It is very alarming, because many of them still use very archaic and outmoded farming practices, to farm. That, of course, will invariably affect the yield. Access to finance is still a huge challenge for smallholder farmers. They are unattractive to, your mainstream investors. Not even an impact investor wouldn't want to invest in smallholder farmers because, the risk is quite high. However, they have come up with several solutions, to invest in smallholder farmers, aggregating them, kind of putting them in association, introduces some kind of formalization where they can have access to credit and for purchase of inputs like seeds, quality seeds, fertilizers, insecticides that will increase the yield. Another area where we need to see impact capital go into reduce post-harvest losses is in the area of infrastructure. And this is something that I believe not only one party can do on their own. We need to have government also involved in addressing the infrastructural gap in the cultural sector. Take, for instance, access road. As basic as it is, there is that huge gap, whether it's accessing your farmland or from farm to market. Access road is an issue where you see sometimes the truck carrying huge amount of produce gets an accident and we lose all of those produce overnight. So that's a regular occurrence, and you see that when you even travel on the highway yourself. There's also it's still on infrastructure, storage facility, as basic and as simple as that. There is that huge gap, and that also constitutes a huge loss in post-harvest loss, which ranges from between 30 to 50% of the total produce that we have in Nigeria. So it's something that we need to urgently address, and it calls for all stakeholders coming on board. And what impact investing can do is first and foremost understanding what are the challenges in this sector. How can we get several kinds of capital to come in? When you need capital to de-risk, it's a high-risk area. So we need more patient capital, to blend with commercial capital and be de-risked in such a way that the right funds are going to the right, smallholder farmers, the right association, the right, enterprise who will now deploy it in such a way that they're addressing some of the challenges in this space. Otherwise, what we'll keep having, I would want to say a big kudos to the government for all the interventions. We have seen several interventions like the Anchor Borrowers Funds, the agricultural business, medium and small investments, schemes like that really have provided access to finance for smallholder farmers. Beyond that, also providing training for them, which is, I will say, more important than just the access to finance, because they need to have the right training. We've seen some success. However, there are challenges that some of these programs are not widely shared. There's a low awareness about these programs in some of these communities. And when they are available, things like, the process just, takes too long. And by the time that they now get access to the finance, agriculture has a cycle. When you pass a certain cycle, you don't need the funds for anything. So they also record high losses. So we need to get the right kind of people coming in, one who have the knowledge, and the private sector can do that with the right funding, right knowledge, right support, both financial and non-financial support, particularly access to market, which is very much lacking in this space. How do we provide opportunities for farmers to have the linkages? So once they produce, it goes to the market, and then the cycle goes on.
Fantastic. So clearly there's a lot that impact investing can do in the agriculture sector. So let's move on now to the health sector. So the health sector has a huge startup capital need, but it requires long-term investment. So you spoke about patient capital also with the agriculture sector. So because it can take a relatively long time for healthcare companies to generate returns. As a result, the sector has not been attractive to investors, especially with the country's low household income level and small middle class size. So how can impact investing help make up for this shortfall in investment in the health sector?
The healthcare sector is very important sector, just like any other sector. The government has a huge part to play in creating that opportunity for impact investment to come into the healthcare sector. I would say that in the last 18 to 2 years, we've seen financing flow to the healthcare sector, particularly the SMEs in that space that are using technology, to scale solution. And that in itself has been able to attract impact investors to invest in those sectors. You see big limited partners, investors looking at, solutions that they can be scaled. We have, for instance, Life Bank. I think in the first, they were able to raise a pre-seed about $500,000, 54 genes, providing solutions across, the continent in terms of gene data, that help to inform, research for pharmaceutical companies. I think 90% of the data that you find that are used by pharmaceutical companies to create drugs and medication is from Caucasian genes, and less than 3% from, Africans. And that in itself, presenting it at a global level was like, we're going to ensure that for every medication, for every drug that is being, designed, takes into consideration people that look like you and me from African descent. So providing that kind of solution was quite attractive to investors, going into support, 54 Gene. And many more other tech-focused, healthcare MSMEs. There's Health Tracker, there's Helium. But if you have the traditional, healthcare service provider, you mentioned something that it takes a long time for you to now recover, funds, and it's not really attractive. Investors, think about the impact that they will make as well as what kinds of returns that they will get, and then maybe exit at certain periods, and maybe exit, like, the report mentioned, is usually a challenge. And it's not only just this report. In terms of engaging with, investors in the space, exit is a challenge, particularly in the healthcare sector, educational sector. So this is where the government needs to come in and see how can we create, with intentionality, outcome funds for the healthcare sector. That is a private partnership, public-private partnership that brings in the government being the commissioner, and then bringing in private sector to deploy capital. The government portion of that will be de-risking instruments to ensure that the losses are lesser for investors. So it is so important. And same thing in the educational sector, because the educational sector is quite, similar, requiring patient capital, and your traditional investor will not be providing patient capital. I mean, they are in it for business. We would need to have, a kind of opportunity where we bring in stakeholders, government, playing a leading role, providing de-risking capital, and even, bringing in other stakeholders like development finance institutions, foundations, who can bring in more capital that are below market rate return to de-risk private sector investment, and then we can address quite meaningfully the challenges that we see in healthcare and also educational sector.
Great. Thank you very much for that answer. So the importance of de-risking definitely stands out for the health sector. Okay, so now on to the education sector. So the education sector also requires significant startup capital. And just like we spoke about, generating financial returns can also take time. So aside from some of the interventions that you've already mentioned, how can this sector take advantage of impact investing?
Yeah, I mentioned earlier in my response to the healthcare sector that one of the innovative solutions that impact investing bring is blended finance instruments, right? I mentioned the outcome bonds. We see education outcome funds being deployed in countries like India. I think India has the largest educational outcome fund. We've also seen one, I think in 2022, launched in Senegal, not too far from us here in West Africa, but an 18 million outcome funds to fund about 325 schools to ensure that they have better educational outcomes in those schools. It's something I think that the government can take a look at and, collaborate with, organizations, institutions like the Outcome Fund, which is, I think, a fund that provides, outcome bonds to countries in Africa, particularly sub-Saharan Africa. How do we collaborate with institutions like that, even with development finance institutions, to deploy capital towards, creating such bonds to ensure that we are addressing specific challenges in the educational sector and be very clear about the kind of outcomes we want to see in the educational sector. One is how do we, reduce the number of out-of-children rates in Nigeria, which is about 18 million, which is high. In terms of infrastructure, there's also an infrastructural gap in education. I think we require about 486 schools to be built, 486,000 schools, I beg your pardon, to be built, which requires huge financial investment. So we can design educational outcome bonds to address, some of these gaps in the educational system. So these are some of the things, that impact investing can do. And I mentioned earlier on, I think when we had a conversation, that impact investing is a strategy. right, and can be used by any investor. So you have to decide what financial instrument that you will use and how that financial instrument is designed with intentionality to achieve specific social and environmental outcomes that are measurable and yet having financial returns. Thank you.
Fantastic. So thank you, Ms. Glover, for what has been a very interesting interview. So I promised our listeners that they will learn a lot of interesting facts about impact investing, and I think you've definitely delivered on that. So thank you to our listeners for your time. Be sure to look out for the full report, Investing for Impact in Nigeria, deep dive into agriculture, education, and health sectors, out later this year. Bye-bye for now.
Thank you for being a part of today's interesting program. You can learn more about the NESG's If Not Now When campaign at www.ifnotnowwhen.ng. You can also listen to other interesting conversations by visiting www.nesggroup.org/podcasts.